I have come home today to Illinois, to my friends and neighbors, to declare that I am a candidate for President of the United States.
4 years ago, Senator Paul Simon came home to Southern Illinois to launch the boldest effort of his political life. Now he's home once again, visiting with us in his Makanda home. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you, Gary. Good to be with you.
And welcome to your fan. Who's this?
This is my one and only grandchild, my granddaughter, Riley Marie, here.
Well, the apple of Southern Illinois' eye in your lap, I guess.
Well, she's drinking some apple juice right now, too.
4 years ago, you were running for president. So let me not save the best question for last. Is there any chance you'll be running again?
No. It was a great experience. I have no regrets for having done it. But you really have to make a decision whether you're going to be a senator or a presidential candidate. It takes about a year out of your senatorial career. When I decided to run for re-election, I decided I was not going to be a presidential candidate.
I've been doing a little boning up, some of the reading I've been doing lately. Winners and Losers by Paul Simon.
Yes.
You mentioned in there that you decided to run 19 months before the election, and that people were telling you that was too late. Do you think that's the case?
Well, I think that year it was. Even this year, I think there are people who have made a decision to run. And one of the potential candidates talked to me just this past week as we're recording this and said, how quickly do I have to make the decision? And I said, by May 1st.
In fact, people talking to you was one of the big factors in your deciding to run. Are there a lot of people out there talking now about the race?
There are people talking about the race. There are also people talking to me, but I've given them the same answer that I'm giving you, that I've made a decision not to run.
Would you care to make any picks for us? Who your choices are in the Democratic Party?
I can tell you who the possibilities are. I got to make sure my granddaughter doesn't
trip
walk
over
through all these wires here now.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, Riley?
Don't want any casualties on emphasis here.
Go ahead, Daddy, there.
So anybody you'd want to mention at all? Anybody you're watching? Anybody you're encouraging?
Well, there are some people that I have been encouraging. There are, I think, among the possibilities, and I'm not precluding others, the two who've already semi-announced are Doug Wilder, the governor of Virginia, and Paul Tsongas, former senator from Massachusetts. Mario Cuomo is a possibility. Bob Kerrey, senator from Nebraska, is a possibility. Al Gore, senator from Tennessee. Bill Clinton, the senator from, the governor of Arkansas. I'm sure I'm skipping some names I should be including. But I think these are among the major possibilities right now.
Do you think it's going to be one of the major possibilities, or are there dark horses out there that might come up?
Well, it could be there are dark horses, and it is remotely possible that we will end up at a convention with no decision made, though I think that is unlikely.
That would be a switch, wouldn't it?
It would be a switch, and there's something to be said for doing it that way and really having a convention be a convention where people could get together and more carefully analyze the possible candidates.
It almost gets back to an old kind of politics, old-style politics. Nowadays, it's more media campaigns, strategizing. You mentioned in your book that there was a decision that you took upon yourself, not that you made it, but you took responsibility for it, that left out appeals in Iowa in particular to rural voters and seniors, and that you felt that was one of the key factors in your, quote, loss in Iowa. Is politics to that kind of narrow strategizing, or is there the old kind of politics still around?
Well, I think that is the old kind of politics also. I think you have to build a base, you have to build a coalition. And two very important groups in Iowa that we did not make targets that I think could have made that difference. When you lose by a very narrow margin, you can always try and calculate, well, if we'd only done this and only done that. And I'm not a great one for going back. Life goes on, you have to move on. But I think that we did make a mistake in not specifically targeting farmers and senior citizens, and in both areas I had a strong record.
You also said in Winners and Losers that you felt that in the general election that President Bush demeaned the presidency as a candidate. Do you still feel that way?
Oh, absolutely. there was really not a discussion of the issues. The Willie Horton ad, for example, was basically a not very subtle appeal to race. And I hope we're moving away from that kind of thing, but I am concerned when I see the president vetoing the Civil Rights Bill on the basis that it will establish quotas, and we specifically have in the bill a prohibition against quotas. I'm wondering why that is done. As we're taping this, we have just, those of us who've been sponsoring the Civil Rights Bill, have had discussions with the Business Roundtable trying to work out a practical compromise. The Business Roundtable are the major American corporations, and the White House called them last Thursday and said, stop the discussions. Don't try and work out a compromise in the Civil Rights Bill. And I wonder what the basis of that is.
Getting back to those media campaigns and what's come to be known as negative campaigning, you've been a student of politics, a historical student, looking back at Abraham Lincoln's formative years, for instance. Did that kind of politics exist in our nation's history, or is this really a new phase that we're entering into?
Well, politics changes regularly, and obviously those television cameras that are on us right now have changed politics fairly dramatically. But there has been, at times past in the nation, a greater focus on the issue, though we have been, as a nation, we have had a tendency to look at personalities more than issues. And we have done that in part because we only have two major parties, unlike, say, the French and the Italians and a number of other parliamentary governments, where the differences are fairly dramatic and there is a greater focus on issues. I would like to see a greater focus on issues, but my fear is that we're going to continue to be personality oriented.
As a journalist, I was interested to read the comments of a former newspaperman himself, chiding the press a little bit, I guess, for some of the questions and some of the coverage that was given to you and the race in general. Can that be changed? Or
well, it can be, and that's very simple, and that would be a very big improvement in and of itself. The New York Times, which I happen to think is probably America's greatest newspaper, but they wrote to each of us who were candidates at that time and said, will you give us your medical records from birth on? Will you tell us your academic records from high school on? Your financial records? It was a whole, who your friends were in high school and college. Now, some of these things are proper. Financial records, I think, is proper because they can get a feel whether you're serving the public or serving yourself. Health records, my health today, that ought to be a matter of public record. But if when I was 18, I had a social disease or something like that, I don't think that necessarily ought to be part of the public domain. But what concerned me more than the questions that were asked were the questions that were not asked. They didn't send me a letter asking me to tell them where I stand on urban education. They didn't ask me where I stand on the deficit and, all the other really key problems. We have played into the personality type of campaign through the media more than the issues.
Where is the campaign going? Not this one in particular, but campaigns in general. There is free media time on the news, but there's also paid time. You quote in your book Lou Harris on election night saying, let me get this exactly right, the simple story of this election is that the Bush commercials have worked and the Dukakis commercials have not. Was it that simple?
Well, I think it was a good part of it. Mike Dukakis waited much too late to respond. He also needed to have a message. At the Democratic Convention, he said, this campaign is not about ideology, it's about competence. He couldn't have been more wrong. I was standing under the platform because they asked the former candidates to stand under the platform and then come up and be with Mike after he got the nomination. And I turned to Gene and I said, that's a great mistake. Every campaign is about ideology. And if you do not force a confrontation on the issues, then you don't do what a campaign should be about.
So where is the Democratic Party these days? I know it's strong on Capitol Hill, but beyond that aggregation of several hundred individuals, where is the National Democratic Party?
It is never easy to know, and there are those who right now are advising the party the way to win. You just become a kind of a warmed over Republican Party, and that way you can win. My own strong belief is that if we do that, we will lose, and we will deserve to lose. That if we tell people, you know, we're not facing our deficit problems, we're not facing our education problems, we're not facing our health care problems, let's move on these things and spell out a program and have a vision for America. George Bush said he's not strong on the vision thing. Well, he is not, but it is more than just a vision. George Bush, and I respect him, and he's an infinitely better president than Ronald Reagan was. But George Bush is a man of inclination rather than conviction. And to lead effectively, you have to believe something.
Another bit of light, not so light reading I've been looking at lately, The Once and Future Democrats, that you wrote back in 1980 after Ronald Reagan won the first time, and charted out a course that you would have liked to have seen for the Democratic Party. One or two chapters, actually, defense and energy, that seem awfully relevant these days. A couple quotes out of it. In your energy chapter, if there is one word that clearly describes the Middle East, it is unstable. Do you feel any responsibility for prescience there?
Well, it has not become stable in the meantime since I wrote that book. You're doing your homework here, Gary.
Pretty easy on issues like this, I'll tell you.
What we have to have is an energy policy. And whether it's the Middle East or, for example, we're heavily dependent on Mexico also. Mexico's economic problems are very major. We could have problems south of the border.
Why is it 11 years later we can still have the discussion? Another quote, without an energy plan, the greater the likelihood that an emergency will resort to force to solve, and you put in quotes, to solve the problem. Are we any further
And that's
away
exactly
from that
what
now?
we have done, obviously. Yes, and the President has announced an energy plan that is not an energy plan. It is just more of the same. His energy plan is, well, let's go into the Alaska wilderness and go after oil there. We ought to be doing research on alternative sources of energy.
Where do you see energy coming into the next presidential election? Is
Well,
the Arctic
if-
going to be a major issue?
I don't think it'll be a major issue, but I think a candidate for president ought to, there are about 4 or 5 basic issues that a candidate for president ought to be hitting. And energy is one. And it is not so much that you're going to garner huge numbers of votes, but you set up a dialogue that whether you win or lose, the public is ahead because they understand the issue a little better. That's the way democracy works.
One issue, defense spending, that is a little tough to talk about. In fact, again, in your book, you quote a colleague saying, I just can't discuss defense rationally back in my district. And you go on to comment something to the effect that, well, if he's not discussing it rationally, I have to conclude that he's discussing it irrationally. Are our discussions about defense spending and security needs a rational discussion?
By and large, we're responding to the defense industries rather than to the security needs of this country. If you were to ask right now, what's the greatest threat to our country, our economy or the possibility of a Soviet invasion, I think it's clearly our economy. And yet we are spending huge, about 60% of our defense budget still is going for a possible Soviet invasion of Western Europe. That threat has all but disappeared. And yet we're spending, for example, 3 times as much per capita for the defense of Western Europe as the Western Europeans are spending.
So what is the fallout of the Gulf War now? Is there going to be a larger push for particularly the kinds of weapons that all of a sudden are supposed to be part of Star Wars, or all kinds of military weapons? Or do you think that's going to pass in the next year or two?
Well, the difficulty is you not only have the pressure from the defense industry lobbyists, you have, because of the Middle East, a kind of a euphoria that says, you know, this money we spent on defense really worked. Well, the reality is most of the money we're spending on these exotic things are for a Soviet invasion, not for the Middle East kind of war. I want a good, strong, flexible response for the Iraq type of situation. But the Patriot missiles, production started on them in 1979. Star Wars, the MX missile, those are all, you know, we didn't use that stuff at all. We've been debating the B-1 bomber for 10 years. Not a single B-1 bomber was used in the Middle East because it's impractical in that situation.
You have a proposal before Congress now. Tell us a little bit about it. The one that deals with shifting defense spending savings into social programs rather than deficit reduction. That's a simplistic approach, but tell us what the details of that are.
Well, it is not really rather than deficit reduction, because I think we also have to reduce the deficit. But the budget agreement that was agreed to at the end of last year set up a special category so that to reduce, to shift from defense spending over to education or healthcare or other needs takes a 60% vote of the Senate and the House. It is a protection for the defense industry that is totally unjustified. And Senator Bill Bradley and I have an amendment in that would reduce that to 50%. So that if I want to take $500 million from Star Wars and put it into Head Start, I can do it. We shouldn't build up this sacred cow of defense and say, oh, we can't touch that. That's defense spending.
Are there other areas? A recent initiative by the President on education. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I welcome the attention to it. I think Lamar Alexander is going to be a take-charge Secretary of Education. I think it's a good appointment. But the President's announcement is all talk, no resources. You know,
what drives our inability to find resources? Is it defense spending? Is it the deficit? Is it a lack of political will?
Well, it's a combination of two of those things, I think, particularly. The deficit means that interest rates are growing very, very rapidly, by far the fastest growing item in the budget. We spent $74 billion on interest in fiscal year 1980. This year we will spend between $287 and $290 billion. Either next year or the following year, for the first time in the nation's history, interest will be the #1 expenditure of the federal government. But I think an even greater problem is the national will. Neither political party is facing up to this thing because it's politically unpopular. And so we're drifting. And long term, that presents real problems. If I can spell out a long-term scenario where I think we're headed, we are to a great extent relying on Social Security retirement funds to buy the bonds of the federal government. Starting about the year 2003, a lot of people are going to be retiring. Starting about the year 2010, a very significant increase. Then we face the choice of doing one of three things. One is to dramatically reduce Social Security retirement pay, and you can guess how politically popular that would be. The second is to significantly increase taxes. You know how popular that would be. And the third option is to print more money. That is the easy way out politically, and that's where we are headed, and of course that's the most dangerous of the three.
One of the ways we find political will is finding out what the people want and think we need. But at the other extreme, again, in the Once and Future Democrats, you talked about how one of the mistakes of the Carter presidency was paying too much attention to polls. I wonder, do you think George Bush is making the same mistake now?
Absolutely, absolutely. The whole Bush administration is geared toward re-election rather than running the government. Once in a while I feel like going over to the White House and saying, George, you're the President of the United States. Be the President. Forget about running for re-election.
The country certainly got behind the Gulf War. You were among those, the many in Congress at the time, who voted against going to war right then and letting sanctions work instead for a while. But then the resolution came up on presidential support, and you were among the vast majority of those who voted with the president on that. Why not be consistent? If it was wrong first, why not vote against it the second time?
Well, I think it was consistent. I think we followed the constitutional process. I think we made a mistake authorizing the use of force, but a majority in the Senate, a majority in the House, by the smallest majority in the history of our country authorizing the use of force, authorize the use of the force. And then once that decision is made, then I think we have to go ahead. Then we have to support our troops. It's the same decision Abraham Lincoln made during the Mexican War.
I was about to ask you about that, in fact.
He opposed the war with Mexico, but once the decision was made, he supported the appropriations for the troops.
Oh, I see. But it was against public opinion, his opposition to the war.
No question about it. No question about it.
And yet he was able to withstand, 10 years later, I think, in the 1858 election, that came up as a fairly major issue, didn't it?
Well, but you have to remember one other thing, and it's hard to know as you go back in history. Abraham Lincoln served only one term in the U.S. House. And it may be that his vote on the Mexican War was the reason for it. We're not sure.
As I said earlier, you've been a student of history, particularly Abraham Lincoln's. The last book I brought along with me today, Lincoln's Preparation for Greatness. Among the remarkable things in this book that you did was go back and do quite a bit of research that would have been the pride of any college professor, I'm sure, to document that the reputation Lincoln had gotten for being something of a log roller was in fact not really true, particularly with the issue of moving the state capital to Springfield. What was it about Lincoln that gave him kind of leadership that apparently, as you discovered, it was not necessarily in vote trading?
Yes, and I think the vote trading tends to be exaggerated even today. I'm not saying that it doesn't take place, but it is not the dominant influence in terms of how decisions are made. I think the reason Abraham Lincoln emerged as such a great president was the character of the man. And it really, if I can use a comparison, when after we launched the attack against the Iraqi troops, President Bush made a speech. He did not mention the casualties on the other side. Abraham Lincoln, in the midst of the Civil War, the most bitter war our country ever got involved in his second inaugural address, when you would expect the leader of one side to say, we're going to beat those so-and-sos, instead he talked about with malice toward none, with charity for all. There was a greatness of spirit about Abraham Lincoln that really was unique among our presidents.
Present company accepted. I'm not sure I find that kind of character, at least in the kind of people that we've been seeing running for president. Maybe it's just not coming through the media, but do we have these kinds of leaders today? If not, why
I
not?
think they are there, but we have to seek them out. And the process does not encourage thoughtful people to seek the presidency, unfortunately.
How can we change that?
I think we need more people like you asking proper questions. I think the media has to bear some responsibility. There are things that, in the '88 presidential race, there were things. David Frost interviewed each of us for an hour. Now, maybe it only reached 1% of the television audience, but at least there were people who had a chance. Marvin Kalb did the same thing. And I think those two television programs, more than anything else the media did, gave people a real chance to see things. Even the so-called debates that we have. One debate, answers were limited to 30 seconds. You know, how can you talk about policy in Central America or the Middle East in 30 seconds? 1 minute was I think, probably as long as any debate permitted.
Like or not what happened to him, one of the people you quote in your book was Gary Hart. I think something to the effect that if you expect bite-sized policy, you're going to get half-pint politicians. Is that what we're getting?
I think to much too great a degree, and it's not only at the presidential level. One of the things that's happening also in the Senate and the House and in governor's races, we're electing far too many people who just hold their finger to the wind and say, what do the latest public opinion polls have to say? And that's discouraging.
Is there a hope for finding leadership in this country? Where are we going to find it? Are the politicians coming up in a younger age, the next generation? Or are we opting for the professional life, the corporate life, or no political life at all?
Fortunately, there are people, but we need to appeal more to young people with ideals and to others. And there are people who are willing to make the sacrifice. Lamar Alexander called me, I guess it's 3 weeks ago, and he said, I've persuaded the the CEO of Xerox to come on as Undersecretary of Education. And I just wanted to tell you, I'm going to be announcing it formally in 2 days. Well, the very fact that David Kern said, I've never met the man, is willing to come on in that kind of a position says something good. And I think there are people who can be appealed to. And, you know, there's no lack of people who have idealism, but we're not appealing to that. We're appealing to the greed in people rather than the noble in people too much.
Would you say that one of the things that marked your campaign was bringing a lot of people into the process that might not have otherwise been there, young people, older people?
I think it is one of the things that I was able to contribute. When I first announced, I remember the statement was, he will have no appeal to young people. I was the oldest candidate in the race. It was just the opposite. Every university campus was my territory. University of Wisconsin, the student newspapers had 3 times as many people outside the hall as inside the hall. At Yale, I had to speak to the crowd outside before I could get inside to speak in the auditorium there.
Well, Senator, it's always a pleasure to have you on campus and a pleasure to be here in your home today. Thanks very much for having us down.
Thank you, Gary. Good to be with you.
If you would like a VHS copy of the preceding program, please send 1995 check or money order to WSIU-TV, Communications Building, Room 1048, SIUC, Carbondale, Illinois 62901. Please include the date of the broadcast.